Morning all.
Morning.
I recognise lots of the faces, but first, was anybody not here last week? Don't worry, you didn't miss anything. No, I'll cover it a little bit. It means hopefully it'll flow a little bit better. So, but it wasn't essential. But I would like a reason for not being here last week presented in writing before the end of today's talk. He thinks I'm serious. Sorry, I have a sense of humour. Okay, thank you. Thanks again for coming. Today's talk, we'll cover a little bit about Mametz Wood last week and the battle and that sort of angle. But this is the more interesting bit for me. I would say that because I spent a year writing it for my MA thesis. And Gareth there, I'll embarrass him again. He spent a year reading it before I submitted it, so the blame is shared, whether you like it or not. What really hit me when I started, I first went to Mametz Wood in 2019, so I'm a newbie to this, I accept that. When I started reading up on it, the thing that really struck a chord with me, as much as the engagement itself and the horrors and all of that, was the aftermath and how these men, their officers, could be so shabbily treated by the establishment and by the British High Command, given what they've done and what they've achieved. So it's become a bit of a soapbox of mine. If any of you are on Twitter, you'll probably find me somewhere, because when Mametz Wood springs up, I'm in there. So that's what today's talk is about. It's what my MA thesis was about, enhancing the redemption narrative. And oh yeah, I remember to work this now. That's the redemption narrative. Basically, and we'll go into it in some detail in the next hour. Even whilst they were fighting in Mametz Wood, certain members of the British High Command, including the Commander-in-Chief, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, were already disparaging the 38th Welsh Division, their efforts on what was going on. And that continued, particularly with Haig, through the war and afterwards. And this notion that the division had failed, that the division had bolted, that the division had run away, and even that the division's ineptitude at Mametz Wood had actually undermined and caused the entire Somme offensive to fail because of the delay in capturing the wood. And this myth was maintained throughout the 1920s, 30s, up until relatively modern times. And this guy, there he is, Colin Hughes. He's not even Welsh, he was from Surrey, I think. His PhD, his doctoral thesis, Mametz, Lloyd George's Welsh Army at the Battle of the Somme, was the first publication that really drove a huge nail into the coffin of the myth of the failure of the 38th and Mametz Wood. It is cited in every and any book on the Somme. Anyone and everyone will cite Colin Hughes' book. It's highly regarded by historians. The arrogance in me will say he didn't get it all right. Hence my MA thesis. One of the things that I don't think Colin did in his book, in his thesis, he didn't answer the question why. And that was the point of my MA thesis. Why did this happen? Why were they denigrated? Why were they ostracised by the rest of the British Army and the public during and after the war? And so in this talk, we'll go into some fair few documents will come up, and I'll run through them with you. But even Welshmen, I've got a quote here from Hubert Williams from Pontypool, who transferred to the 38th. in February 1916, I was astonished at the low standard of training of the Welsh division. The higher command had a similar view. And he's actually quite right. The 38th is what we covered last week. You know, its training by the War Office in Britain was pretty poor. But they were at the tail end of the new armies. They were the fifth iteration of the new armies. They were probably only the 36th Ulster Division came after them. But bear in mind, the 36th Ulster Division was a paramilitary organisation that had already been armed by Carson and co. because of what was going on with the partition of Ireland. So they were pretty handy with their rifles anyway. You know, the Welsh boys, some of them hadn't even fired on the range before they went to France. So their training was poor. And then you get this quote from it's in the Western Mail, 1935, so it's still bugging them. The difficulties of the division were not decreased by its commander and most of the staff being changed by Field Marshal Haig at the height of the battle. Yeah, fair point, not entirely accurate, as we'll see. So this narrative of cowardice has grown up and grew up until 1980, and that book is published. But there are still aspects of it that remain. Even today, and some of the more modern and, dare I say, enlightened historians still trade on some of these tropes. And so what I wanted to do was have a look at where the truth really lies. What was behind all of this? And what I came up with, they were the three facets of the thesis that I looked at and I contend played a major part. The Welshness of the division, it's got the name, the 38th Welsh Division, but everything that went with that about Wales. Political dynamics at the time, and yes, David Lloyd George is a very, very big part of that. And then this thing about the military prowess of the formation and the absence of a martial history in the Welsh soldier, which again I touched on last week. And if you were here last week, Flung Aside is of Little Worth was the title of that talk from Llewellyn Wyn Griffiths' book Up to Mametz. But it shows that even at that point, he wrote it in 1931, but even at the point they were marching away from Mametz Wood, you know, the measure of our condition was the measure of the price paid for Mametz Wood. The largest of the woods in the Somme battlefield had reduced a strong division to a shadow. In the capture of this obstacle to our advancing line, we discharged our immediate task, only to be ourselves flung aside as of little worth. So they were sensing it. Even then they were feeling it, that what they'd done, what they'd achieved was of little worth in the eyes of the British High Command. Go on, 1924, but Mametz Wood was not a battle honour, by the way. There were questions asked in Parliament in 1924 excuse me, as to why this was the case, and the War Office came back and said, yeah, well, it's not a battle honour because, well, not for the 38th anyway. Their divisional command was not within the area of the engagements for the requisite period of time. So tough, you know, you can't have a battle honour. And it's even raising its head in the 30s as well. Again, more questions. There's letters to the Western Mail. So, arguably, this again shows British High Command didn't want to play, didn't want to allow these men the plaudits that they deserved. This is I mentioned Professor Christopher Williams, who sadly passed away a couple of weeks ago. Eminent Welsh historian. It was his article, A Question of Legitimate Pride. Try and log that in the back of your minds for a few slides on. Question of Legitimate Pride. Which, again, inspired me to do the thesis. But even he, writing about the 38th Welsh Division, so this is something he knocked out for a BBC article in 2016 on the centenary. And the record of the division was controversial at the time, yeah, you don't say. Rumours circulate of Welsh troops bolting and panicking. We'll come to that in some fine detail. One military historian writing in 1919 argued that the failure to take Mametz would swiftly give the Germans the opportunity to reorganise their defences, ensuring the Somme battle would be prolonged well into the autumn and its objectives only partially achieved. I will introduce you to that military historian and what was written and the background behind that. Somewhat disingenuous of Professor Williams. Such views are today largely discredited. Yeah, okay. It is true that Major General Sir Ivor Phillips was out of his depth and his dismissal as divisional commander was justified. No, it bloody wasn't. Okay? He is trading on a trope there, and it's something that this is really is the bee in my bonnet about Ivor Phillips. So much so, I declare an interest. I'm actually writing his biography at the moment. Nobody else has ever done it. I just wish he'd left some letters in the diary because it'd been a bit easier. But I contend that is wrong. He was a victim. He was a scapegoat, and we'll go into that. That's one of the key parts of this talk and my thesis. It says, given their limited training, their lack of combat experience, and the difficulty of the challenge they faced, the dogged determination of the men of the division was impressive. You're damn right it was. Okay, so I'll agree. But what my point in this is that little bit in there, that's one of the tropes, that's one of the myths that has still to this day raises its ugly head within the historiography of Mametz Wood. And others that remain, one is that the 38th were ordered before any attack that if they came up against machine guns, they weren't to advance, they were to turn around, go back to their start point, and then we'd call for an artillery barrage. Absolute nonsense, no evidence of it. In fact, evidence totally to the contrary. They were poorly drilled and in an inefficient and mediocre formation. Well, they might have been when they went to France, but there's certainly evidence to say that they improved rapidly, and they might not have been blooded in battle, but they were committed and enthusiastic, bless them, and they did the job they were asked to do, and they did it better than anyone expected, because the reality is they were expected to fail. And Welsh soldiers lacked discipline, they couldn't be trusted. Yeah, there's a little grain of truth, an element of truth in that. I don't know whether it's Welsh soldiers or just Welsh soldiers from the Rhondda. And we'll touch on that in a little while as well. So that's where this is going today. Again, that's just straight. This was lifted to put in the Thursday's talk. Lloyd George's Welsh Army, Queen's Hall speech, and where he is appealing to the martial tradition of Wales in London, to the Welsh diaspora, the London Welsh there, to encourage the Welsh to sign up. It's not right to say that Wales was tardy in answering Kitchener's call. Wales wasn't, and there's some data that Matthew Crago and Chris Williams put together for their book Wales and the Wall, which shows that per capita Wales probably had more serving than the other three nations of the UK. So any myth that Wales wasn't committed to the First World War can be knocked on the head by research and data. The interesting thing for me with this, and this is a wide-ranging speech of Lloyd George's, it's regarded as one of his biggest, and as I said last Thursday, he was really conflicted before making this speech. He really didn't know which way he was going to go. He was noted for his opposition to the war in South Africa. He was universally despised throughout the United Kingdom, not just in England, but also in Wales. There's, I think I've got the quote here. Yeah, in 1913, the Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine is called the Magga. If you Google it, you can access its contents. It goes back to the latter part of the 18th century. It had a huge staff. It had over 200 ex-military and serving military working for it, writing articles. Its reach was phenomenal. It was the first publication to put out Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It serialized it. And in a letter to his publisher, Conrad says, I've traveled all over the world. I've been in British military messes all over the world. I've been in on naval ships, and never have I not found a copy of the Maga. It was the go-to magazine for the military, the higher echelons of the military. Very influential. And so, you know, a columnist in 1913 writing about Lloyd George. Maybe I've forgotten something. I knew it was going too well. That makes a difference. His speeches on the war in South Africa should have been sufficient in themselves to exclude him forever from holding office in a British cabinet. There's a quote from somebody, and it is in the Ronda in 1913, November 1913, where a woman is reported as saying, "The only way this bonfire celebration in the Ronda could be any better is if that effigy of Lloyd George was replaced by the real thing." You know, he's not, as Cecil Harmsworth said, he was the most hated individual in Britain at the moment because of his stance on the Boer War. And then he doesn't endear himself to the military. As Chancellor, he's involved in cuts to the army in favour of the navy because of the dreadnoughts. He's involved in mitigating the Curragh incident in 1914, where the Protestant officers of the British Army basically, they call it the Curragh Mutiny. It wasn't a mutiny, but they're basically saying, if we're called upon to fight Irish nationalists, we're out. We're leaving the British Army. There's a huge furore over it. The only thing that basically causes it to die down is the outbreak of the First World War. But Lloyd George is involved in trying to mitigate that. There are rumours that he's involved in a plot to take the army into Ulster, to overthrow the Home Rule Bill, and there's all of this stuff going on. He winds up Hague. Hague calls him one of the pack of rascals that are ruining the country. That's in 1910. So if you read anything about the dispute between Hague and Lloyd George in the back of the memoirs, which says that Hague only started disliking Lloyd George in 1917 because of what he did to undermine him with Nivelle and trying to get a supreme commander involved, is nonsense. Hague, who, I'm not an anti-Haguist, okay, let's get this straight. I'm not in the Butcher Hague category. I'm not in with Chateau Generals and lions led by donkeys. Hague was an amazing commander of the British Expeditionary Force. He could be innovative, but when it comes to, if I'm taking sides in the Hague Lloyd George furore, then I come down on David Lloyd George's side. Hague was duplicitous, disingenuous, dishonest, not quite the shining knight that a lot make him, and we'll touch on some of that later on. So yeah, Hague and Lloyd George, his animus towards Lloyd George goes back a lot longer than the First World War. But it's interesting, he can only, in this martial tradition of Wales, he's harping back to, you know, the Battle of Crecy and that sort of stuff. And Wales, as we will see, was not noted for its martial tradition. But very, very briefly, this puts Mametz, this, as you can see, 14th of July. You know that this is after the engagements at Mametz Wood, which is just by there. But that's the German second line there. And the whole point of capturing Mametz Wood was to allow the left flank of Hague's proposed advance up onto the Byzantine Ridge to be secured. So you've got Bernafray Wood and Trones Wood over here on the right flank. They were captured relatively early on, as was Caterpillar Wood. But the second line, Mametz would, the two copses, Flatiron and Sabo Copse by there, they were still held by the Germans. They were linked into the German second line, so they were easily reinforced. You've got Contalmaison over there. So that's why it became so important. And as I said last week, Haig recognised on the 1st of July, on the evening of the 1st of July, that he was going to move the main thrust of his assault on the Somme south of the Albert-Bapaume road down here, so he could attack up there, break through the second and maybe even the third lines, put his cavalry divisions in behind, and then they were going to head up that way towards Bapaume to roll up the German defences. And as my mentor Gary Sheffield wrote, Haig's operational plan was sound in principle, but far too ambitious in practice, given the state of the training and inexperience of his army. And that's the reality of it, is that not just the 38th Welsh Division, but the new army divisions weren't supposed to be there. When Kitchener foresaw a long war in the August, September of 1914, and he put out his famous call, your country needs you. He envisaged that his new armies would not be combat ready until 1917. That was always the intention. And as I said last week, the British plan to fight a war against Germany was give the French and Russians lots of money, supply them with munitions, and if necessary, ships and guns. Keep our Navy active, the British Navy, biggest in the world, to blockade Germany, and we weren't going to put boots on the ground. That was the intention. Until 1917. And the plan then was, by that time, German forces would be exhausted, French forces would be not quite as exhausted as the German forces, neither were the Russian forces, and then this huge million-man new army would then cross the channel, knock the Germans on the head ultimately, and basically we would effectively have control of the continent. Not that we wanted control of the continent, we just didn't want anybody getting the ports on the French and Belgian coast that could threaten Britain. That was the strategy in a nutshell. Because of the losses, because of what happened then with Russia weren't performing as well as they perhaps said they would, massive conscript army. The Germans had dug in from December 1914, in fact even earlier, September, the Battle of the Aisne. So we get these immovable trenches. Once the race to the sea, where we tried to outflank each other, ended up in the first Battle of Ypres in October 1914, once that had come to an end, nobody was going anywhere. Germans are on the high ground, they're digging in, lots of concrete, very difficult to shift. French and the British, they're not digging in so much, although they've got trenches, because they don't want to appear that that's it, we finished. They're going to attack. So that's why Mametz would become very, very important. And Haig, and to a certain extent Rawlinson are in charge of 4th Army. Haig invests a lot, personally and politically, in the Somme offensive. As I said last week, he didn't want to fight there in 1916, he wanted to wait till 1917, he wanted to fight in Flanders, up north, because he knew the ground. But then the Germans intervene, and in February 1916 they attack the French at Verdun, and they're bleeding them white. And the French are constantly onto the British. You've got to attack. Because the understanding was the British and French would attack on the western front, the Russians would attack on the eastern front, and the Italians would attack on the southern front and the Isonzo against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a coordinated, we're all going to attack at this point. And the Germans threw a spanner in the works. And the importance of this is Haig is constantly on the move after the 1st of July. Trying to get the commanders, Horn in 15 Corps, where the 38th are fighting, they desperately try to get him to take this wood so that they can attack the Byzantine Bridge. So he's invested a lot in it. And very, very briefly, 2 nice little maps. That's taken from the War Diary of 115 Brigade, which is Horatio Evans' gang. And they're the ones that attack the Hammerhead on the 7th of July, where they're literally having tried to change the plan because Evans was an experienced soldier. He knew that the enfilading fire from the machine guns in Flatiron and Savo Copse would cut his men to pieces across what becomes known as Death Valley, and it comes to be, and 400 are lost. Even as they are being killed, Haig is writing in his diary that basically they didn't get in the wood. A few hundred men, only a few hundred men could have got in there. They could have wrapped the whole wood up because there's no Germans in there. Wrong. A week later, he's writing in his diary and attaching a memo which says that the way that Horn was running attacks on the Mametz wood, the piecemeal attacks, emboldened the Germans. They were reinforcing the wood constantly. Haig was quick to write off the 38th Welsh Division based on lies. That's the reality of it, or certainly misinformation that he was being fed, potentially by Horn. Yeah, down this, that's 17th Division, so they attack. That's on the 7th of July. This map is taken from David Jones's diaries, who wrote in parenthesis the long epic poem about Mametz Wood. He actually fought there. He was a private in the London Welsh. Artist, poet, author. And that just shows in a snapshot of the 10th of July attacks on the southern portion of the wood, which is ultimately successful after 2 days of fighting. In between, on the 8th and 9th, there are other attacks penciled in. One on the overnight 7th, 8th, which 113th Brigade are tasked to undertake, and it doesn't come off. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail later, because that's the catalyst for Ivor Phillips, who's in charge of the 38th Welsh Division, for him getting the sack. And responsibility rests elsewhere. So, in the aftermath of the attacks on the Mametz Wood, certainly in the media, in the press, very, very positive. And you can see the Guardian there, 14th of July, Mametz Wood, thought too strong to attack and heard of by the world while it lay behind the German front line, has now become an imperishable landmark in the story of the great battles of Picardy. Stirring details published of the fighting earlier in the week in the Mametz Wood and Contalmaison, it is evident that Mametz Wood and Contalmaison will remain amongst the most glorious names in British military annals. That's, of course, Welsh. The definite clearing of the enemy out of Mametz Wood and its complete occupation by our troops is an achievement which reflects the greatest credit on those engaged in the operation. Not something, a view that is replicated by Sir Lawrence Kidgel, Lancelot Kidgel, Haig's Chief of Staff, who basically says that the Welshmen did not perform up to the standards of the British Army. But that's what's going out, that's the media, that's what the public is seeing. I mean, but closer to home, Liverpool Daily Post, the headline, Cymru Ambeth, charge of the Welsh Division, thrilling battle episode. Nothing, he says, could surpass the courage and determination displayed by the young Welshman in the memorable charge which culminated in driving back the enemy. We had accomplished more successfully than had ever been anticipated the task which had been entrusted to us. They didn't think they could do it. That's the reality of it. And I posed this question last week about if this task is so hard, why put a green division in to do it? And it was because, and there's evidence to show it happened time and time again throughout the First World War on the Western Front at least, you put these newbies who want to prove themselves, they want to show that they're made of the same stern stuff as the regular army, because these are volunteers, not conscripts, they've volunteered to do this. And they would take risks that regular troops wouldn't take, and they certainly did. So that's quite telling there. And Rawlinson, Commander-in-Chief of the 4th Army, who led the Battle of the Somme, he'd made no provision for Mametz wood in the plan. There's no mention of it because it was thought too difficult. And even though Haig had told him that he wanted it taken, Rawlinson still persisted in trying to avoid having to take the wood, and he wanted to suppress the Germans in there by artillery fire. But Haig, in the end, Haig had to write to him and say, you will take it. And again, you know, the Times, one of the most difficult enterprises which fell to any division. It was left to the Welsh division and they swept the enemy out of it. From end to end, there's not a living German in the wood now. Remember that and contrast it with some of the quotes that I will give you from British High Command later on in this talk. All positive up to now. And then we get this. Now this is the time. See, then this was written before that last quote. Philip Gibbs, eminent war correspondent, very well connected. But the heroes of the battle, they are men from nearly all of our English counties. From Northumberland, I'm not anti-English, by the way, I'm not a rabid nationalist or anything, but this is what's being written at the time now, from all our English counties. From Northumberland, Durham, Lancashire and Yorkshire, from the Midlands, the home counties and the West Country. Welshmen were there, and Irish, Highlanders and Lowlanders. It was a British battle, but the greatest share of it fell to England alone, and it was the English lads from the north who fought on the way to Contalmaison and took this stronghold of the woodlands. It's factually incorrect, it's wrong, it's a lie. Northumberland Fusiliers did relieve the 38th Welsh Division in the early hours of the 12th of July. But at that point, they had captured 99% of the wood, and the Germans had evacuated the wood. So we see this is really the start, in some respects, in the public domain, of the narrative coming out. It wasn't really the Welshmen who achieved anything. When I started my research, I got actually very surprised. Conan Doyle and John Buchan had written histories of the Somme. Conan Doyle spent a lot of his own money. I think he did 6 volumes of the First World War campaign. This one that covers Mametz wood, he actually published in early 1917. He spent his own money. He wasn't officially recognised as a war historian, but he had lots of contacts, and he used those contacts. Not entirely accurate in some respects, looking back with what we know now, because of course he didn't have access to official documents and war diaries and papers. But it wasn't a bad stab, and he's very appreciative of the work of the Welsh division. Turning Point's not up there, but H. Perry Robinson, a noted publisher and journalist, he sent dispatches back from the Western Front, and in 1917 he published Turning Point about the Battle of the Somme, and he gives detailed account again of Mametz wood. Doesn't stint in his praise of the 38th. John Buchan, 39 steps and all that. A lot of errors in his account, but one of the things he does say that British troops were well established in the wood of Mametz when all available evidence shows this to be incorrect. He's still in positive. He just gets it wrong. He gets his dates wrong. You get Arthur George publishing the Welsh of Mametz, who wins the crown at the Eisteddfod in 1918. Nicholson and Williams. There's a Welsh view of Mametz wood and how the division covered itself in glory. So in the public domain, there's a lot of praise for the Welsh guys. This is the Turning Point. So strong was it held to be that I know that there were those who at the beginning of these operations considered we could never carry it directly, but should have to content ourselves with working around it, keeping it masked until we could isolate and reduce it as if by siege. That was Rawlinson's plan. And then, talking about forcing our way systematically through from the south to the north. But no mention that it says the magnificent testimony, the stubbornness and courage of our troops, but not the Welsh troops. So that is studiously missing from that. And then we get to this. This is where we start to get a little bit of a change. The book's published in 1938. It's Captain Dunn, he's Royal Welsh Fusiliers, he was a medic. And he writes this in his diary in January 1918, but it's quite telling. We transfer to the 38th Division any day. We are going to a division begotten in Welsh parish politics, one on which the War Office looked askance until it had to send it overseas, and which has been in GHQ's bad books since the Mametz muddle, although some excellent officers have been given command of its units. So that's the view in January 1918 of effectively an officer and an ordinary regular soldier. And it's a very well thought of memoir. It's used. And that division begotten in Welsh parish politics, Gary Sheffield in his 2 books on Hague, from Somme to Chief and from Somme to Victory, which is an update of the first one, he uses that. But he uses it in a pejorative sense. He looks at it as it's a downer, it's a bad thing. He fails, and I love him to bits. I spent 2 years with him, but he's ignoring what was happening in the rest of the country. There was nepotism. Politics did involve itself right throughout England, Wales and Scotland in the creation of the new armies. Aldermen and mayors and Lords Lieutenants were all offering jobs to their mates or their sons. The reality was, in Wales, there were very few Welsh officers available in the regular army because, we'll come to it now, the army wasn't a popular thing for the Welshmen. So it's a bit disingenuous in my opinion. I've told him that. He doesn't agree with me, but hey, he is a professor after all, so I suppose he gets some. But it's this politics. The politics are a big thing, and Lloyd George is a huge factor in, I think, in the emergence of the criticism. Okay. Major General Sir Ivor Phillips, KCPDSO. He wasn't a Sir at the time. He gets knighted in 1970. These are some of the quotes about him, which are used liberally in a number of the histories of Mametz wood. The division is good, but he, Richard Haking, has no confidence in him as a commander. A jumped up Indian Army Major, Air Vice Marshal Sir Philip Gane, mentioned, we'll come to that in a sec. Charles Bonham Carter. The 38th had been raised as a purely Welsh division on, I believe, the recommendation of Lloyd George. Yeah. Its weakness was not in the men, but the commander was an MP who had retired from the Indian Army early and was ignorant. He was ignorant, lacked experience, and failed to inspire confidence. Drake Brockman. He will take up the last part of this talk in some fine style. It's worth mentioning at this stage, these two, Bonham Carter and Drake Brockman, served in 2nd Division. They were on the staff, and it was the commander, Herbert Watts, who took over from Phillips when he was sacked. And this pair went with Watts to oversee the attack on Mametz Wood on the 10th of July. That, as you can see, was unpublished, so that never got in the public domain per se, but it is liberally quoted in histories of the Somme and Mametz Wood. Similarly with Drake Brockman, his letter to the official historian in 1930 is publicly available now in the National Archives, but it wasn't publicly available at the time. And it's quite interesting to note that the official historian, he wrote a 12-page missive, which we will go through. The official historian ignored almost every word of it, and we'll go through why. Phillips, as I said, I'm writing his biography. He is a fascinating man. He is not ignorant, and he wasn't out of his depth. He was born in Warminster, second son of James Erasmus Phillips, the vicar of Warminster. His elder brother Jon Williams becomes Viscount St David's. next brother down, Owen Cosby, becomes Baron Clinvent. They are regarded universally, they regard themselves and the public as Welsh, even though they were born in England, but it's their family history that goes back to the 11th century, back to Pembrokeshire. He restores, after the war, he ends up restoring Pembrokeshire Castle, or at least stopping it falling down. Picton Castle is refurbished by either Jon Williams or Owen Cosby, I can never remember which. But although they were born and brought up in England, they regard themselves and are regarded as Welsh. And you know, Haig in his diary when he first meets Phillips in 1950, the Welsh MP. So they're really proud of their Welsh roots, and he really hankered after being commander of the Welsh division. I'm going up to Parliament next week, to the Parliamentary Archive, to look at some letters that he wrote to Lloyd George, and there's no doubt he really wanted the job, and Lloyd George got him the job. But at the time, arguably, there weren't that many people who could have done it anyway, despite what others have said. But he was an Indian Army veteran. He served with the 5th Gurkhas, highly sought after position. Lots of British officers joining the Indian Army wanted to serve with the Gurkhas, and this comes back to martial spirit. They were thought to be one of the real fighting units of the British Army and the Indian Army, along with the Sikhs and your Scots, the Highlanders. This martial race theory that permeated the British Army at the time. So really, really highly sought after posting. The one thing that you will, if you do any reading about the Indian Army as opposed to the British Army in India, different kettle of fish. British Army in India is basically the 2nd Battalion of a British regiment goes to India to serve. So they're out there as a British battalion. He joins the Indian Army, which is managed by the India Office, and you have a very small cadre of British-born officers at the top. They then have Indian NCOs under them who basically run things, but they're in charge. So you only have 5 or 6 of these, and they are expected. He goes out as a lieutenant, but he's doing the work of a major. So his first deployment is to Burma. He takes a police battalion out there of over 200. So he's in command of twice as many troops as his equivalent in the British Army would be. Very highly, a lot of responsibility. They're magistrates, all sorts going on. So he's not the dummy that these individuals make out that he is. These individuals all have one thing in common. They are regular, high-ranking officers in the British Army, and he's got a job that they think one of theirs should have had. That's a lot of the furore about it. But he's a highly becomes a highly well thought after MP and businessman, highly successful businessman as well in his own right. But all of the criticism of him throughout the ages is all based on this stuff, and nobody's ever gone in behind it to look at the truth. Until now, and me writing his biography. So watch this space. Something I just spotted here. There's a quote from this bloke who's ignorant and can't do anything. Rees, who is Brigadier General, who comes into the division, says, he wrote to this is from his letter to the official historian. He was running almost a complete division, so that's 10,000 men, as regards units, and overstretched as regards men, entirely alone. He recruited the division. Although there's a lot going on in Wales, he's at the tip of the spear in terms of this division being created. And units are being funneled into him up in North Wales, and he's virtually on his own. He might have somebody to do some filing for him, and he managed it. He was a unique organiser. He was known for his organisational skills and his logistic skills. That's what he got his DSO for in China, in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. He's mentioned in dispatches on the northwest frontier of India, the northeast frontier, highly respected in the Indian Army, very well thought of, but not so much by the British regular army, it would seem. Oh yeah, let's go back to that in a minute, just so. Haking, he's in charge of 13 Corps that the 38th go to when they first go to France. He is a very close associate of Douglas Haig. They went to Staff College together. Haig got him his promotions, got him his Corps command, and there's all of these links will come together. Another reason, I think, for the criticism of Phillips, and the criticism of Phillips and the criticism of 38th Welsh Division are inextricably linked, is the Battle of Lewes. And Jon Williams, I've mentioned him, first Viscount St David's, Ivor's elder brother. He says this in the House of Lords, 16th of November 1915. On September the 25th, Battle of Lewes, our gallant men broke the lines, all three of them. They were clean through them. There would have been a great victory, but there was bad staff work. There were no reinforcements, and the whole thing fell through. Entirely true, succinct and true. The issue, Battle of Lewes finished John French as Commander-in-Chief of the British Expeditionary Force. He'd had command of the reserves. Haig was in command of the actual battle. French didn't release the reserves soon enough, so the British failed. Haig was very reliant on gas. This is the Battle of Lewes is the first use of poisonous gas by the British Army on the Western Front. And it doesn't go right. It blows back in our faces, all sorts of things go wrong with it. And he was using gas because they didn't have enough troops, is the bottom line, but they felt they had to attack. And so Ivor Phillips's older brother stands up in Parliament and he gives this lot, so there's Haking, Horn, Rawlinson, Haig. He gives them a good kicking on the floor of the House. You might think that when Ivor turns up with the 38th Welsh Division in France in December 1915, barely 6 weeks after this, that might be a reason why this man decides he doesn't really like him, because his brother's given him a bit of a kicking. At least that's what I contend. On the previous slide, Bonham Carter, I mentioned him on Thursday, but he's Bongy Bonham Carter, by the way, not to be confused with the other Bonham Carters, and yes, they are related to the Harry Potter thing, Helena. His brother is, I can't think of his first name, he's Asquith's private secretary, he's married to Asquith's daughter. Lloyd George, inextricably linked with the 38th Welsh Division and creating it, ousts Asquith as Premier. Again, 1954. You may take the view that there's a little bit of bitterness in Bongy's unpublished biography. It's certainly something that hasn't been brought up previously. But yeah, so you can start to see these threads that run through it. Of the jealousies and all of the revenge that perhaps people want, which impacts on, and it's not their fault, on the men of the 38th Welsh Division. Yeah, we'll come back to Drake Brockwood later. So, and just very briefly, to sort of knock this theory of Phillips's incompetence on the head. This is a memo he had drafted when they first, what's the date on there? So that's the 8th of December. They've literally landed in France. They've been there 3 days. He's recognised that there's a problem with the training that they had on Salisbury Plain. So he's putting in place a series of schools and training for his division in musketry, bombing, engineering work, digging trenches and that sort of stuff. So he gets that going. And this is in January of 1916, written by Haking, or it's been sent by Haking to the division. They've completed their training, so they're being puppy walked by the Guards Division at this point. Although, of course, a good deal remains yet to be done, the division has made more rapid strides towards efficiency than any of the several new formations I've had under my command during the campaign. So they're top of the class. again, this flies in the face of what comes out after Mametz would. And historians have not gone back into looking at this. This is freely available, but they've allowed the tropes to permeate through the history and not challenge them. This is a hard one to read, and I should have actually translated. What they become noted for, and particularly the Royal Welsh Fusiliers in the division, are trench raids. Trench raids are used to sort of, keep them on their toes, build up, particularly for the newbies, get a bit of combat in, sneaking across no man's land. Dangerous enterprises. They can be taken by, a small patrol or even a company. They lose men to them, but the aim is, keep the enemy on its toes, keep their fighting spirit up, capture some prisoners, gain some intelligence. And they become known for their trench raids, and this goes up to Hague, a minor operation, but this was a very gallant effort, especially considering that the wire had to be cut by hand. So this is Haking. Haking's, no great fan of this, but they've put these measures in place. This is not the inefficient bunch of Welsh Valley dummies that later they are portrayed as. After Mametz would. But here are some guys. Look at how old do you reckon he is? 17, probably. He's the character. It's a lovely photo. You can sit here and watch. Look back there having a kick. They're lovely just watching, looking at these photos. I think it's taken on Salisbury Plain. Unknown battalion of the Welsh Regiment. 50 down there, I don't know what that means. Anyway, but this, again, when we look at how the Welsh soldier is viewed, the ordinary Welsh recruit, if not dealt with sympathetically, is a most difficult man to deal with. He is always sure, but often remarkably slow. Being very self-conscious and easily offended, he seems to carry with him a sort of shell, and when an officer or instructor is unnecessarily harsh with him, he disappears into this shell, and while he is there, nothing on earth can move him, and no more useless person lives. Anonymous. Yeah. So, we need to understand at the time, and again we touched on this last week, is the societal issues. Wales was not fond of the British Army. At this point, wasn't anti the British Army, but there were a lot of other better professions that young Welshmen could take on. Mines, ports, all of these paid better. 1.3, I mentioned last week, 1.3% of the British Army, only 1.3% was Welsh, or identified as Welsh. By July 1914, it had got up to 3%, so it had doubled. But the cadre of senior officers in the British Army at that time, they are all drawn from the landed gentry, okay, the hunting, fishing, squirearchy. Now, not necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of the things they got up to, riding horses, jumping over fences, shooting, quite handy if you're in the army. But at this point, Wales is changing. Wales is squirearchy, Wales is gentry, has become more linked to industry, commerce, self-made money makers, as opposed to this hereditary run predominantly in England. So you start to get this, they're rubbing up against, the officers are rubbing up against each other. And there's a lot of commentary, as it says, in John Davis, the noted Welsh historian, says, Wales, there are foundations of a definitive national identity highlighting the differences to England. Wales, it's got its own university at this point. We're getting the disestablishment of the church in Wales. Nonconformism has got a big hold in Wales in certain parts anyway, different to the Anglican Church in England. So there are differences between England and Wales, and the commentators, and dare I say it, the British High Command, they're different and they can't understand it. Very similar to what we get today. Dare I say it, history repeating itself. But you see, and then we go back to the MAGA here, there's a quote, the vindictive bitterness of feeling that the chapel has for the church in Wales. So you've got a religious scrap going on between nonconformism and the disestablished church. And then, for many years, this is called She, England, for many years England has been prevented by a coalition of Scots, Irish and Welsh malcontents from having her own way. Think about it. And I'm not being anti-English, please, don't think that. This is what's being said at the time. And these societal changes and differences all factor into the approach to Welshmen and Welsh soldiers. And use a bit more of it. Purely Welsh regiments are not to be trusted, so Welsh soldiers are untrustworthy, always wild and insubordinate, required to be stiffened by a strong infusion of English or Scotch. That's Kitchener's view of the Welsh soldier, as it's in, you can buy that, it's online, Asquith Letters, to Lloyd George. Just as an aside, everybody, if you ever get into a debate with anyone about Lloyd George, it always comes up about his extramarital activities. Well, they were all at it. Okay, it's as if Lloyd George was the only bloke that had mistresses and was a bit, but they were all at it.
When they got caught.
Well, yeah, there's that. I can't think of his name. It's not Grierson. He's the one that died on the train on the way over to Flanders in 1914. He was a big fat bloke and he died. He would have taken over from French. If he hadn't died, Haig wouldn't have got the job. But the Quartermaster General of the British Army stays behind in London and spends the entire autumn and winter of 1914 and into 1915 servicing the wives and mistresses of all of his colleagues that have gone over to France. He's well noted for it. It's I can't remember his name. Anyway, I digress. This is Reckington. Talking about flipping extramarital affairs, he gets kicked out of the British Army because he has a fling with a fellow officer's wife. It's reprehensible, was not allowed, but he's a very, very important man. So the Welsh soldier was a scout by nature, not inclined to organisation and discipline. Yeah? And my old mate again, Gary Sheffield, he says Reppington is the single most significant military journalist of the period, impeccably well connected and a highly influential military thinker. He's behind a lot of the intrigue that goes on within the British Army, and behind the battles, and the gas and bombs and death and destruction and all of that. There's so much more going on behind, and the intrigue between senior officers is absolutely fascinating. This is one I shouldn't get wound up about Raymond Asquith. He was killed on the Western Front, and if you've been out there, a lot of people visit his grave. He's the eldest son of Herbert Henry, and so he gave his all. But I get wound up when I read this. This is he puts this in a letter, and as he talks about Welsh soldiers, little black spectacled dwarves. A surplus of nerves and vocabulary, tiny little tots, utterly unfit for anything more strenuous than a children's ball. And at this time, and I suppose even now to this day, calling someone a child, likening their behaviour to children, it's disparaging, it's insulting, and you've got. It's linked in actually to the martial race theory. Short people, they don't make great soldiers. Funnily enough, flipping Goethers are tiny, and Phillips refers to them as my little men. And Phillips was 6'5", so that would make it an interesting photograph. But But Sassoon does it. If you've read, I've got the quote here somewhere. Where are we? Memoirs of an Infantry Officer. When Sassoon is in 7th Division and they are relieved by 38th on the 5th of July before Mametz would. And he says they're a jostling company of exclamatory Welshmen, a panicky rabble, mostly undersized men like a lot of children, a forlorn crowd of khaki figures, half-trained civilians. Well, it's not like Siegfried Sassoon had been in the army for decades at that point. But that's, as you can see, it's this English view of Welshmen. Yeah, Welshmen were short, or a proportion of the population were, for a variety of reasons, ill health, poor living conditions, food. In fact, they had to bring the Bantam Battalion, but that's why the Bantam Battalion heights were dropped from like 5'3", 5'2", 5'1", 5 foot. Right, Welsh can fit in now. That's where and it was only when they dropped it to that level you could get Welsh Bantam battalions. Matthew Craig and Chris Williams' book on the First World War goes into that in some detail. And there's some articles online. 5'5" I can't remember it. But that's what Lloyd George plays on as well when he talked in his Queen's Hall speech about 5'5" countries. When the Germans, were invading Belgium, he's likening himself. He's the short arse, for want of a better word. But again, this all goes to the lack of enthusiasm and lack of respect shown by predominantly English army officers towards the Welsh soldier, which I think factored into the what happened after Mametz would. But I'm looking at the time now. Ooh, bloody hell. Very brief. The Welsh soldier didn't enamour himself to the British High Command either. South Wales borderers were a bloody nuisance, to be frank. In 1915, whilst they're on Salisbury Plain, there are at least 2 mutinies, for want of a better word, amongst the companies of the South Wales borderers and Welsh, Rhondda. Basically, with the South, it all goes on about how they were trained. The South Wales borderers mutiny because of the use of #1 field punishment, which is where if you get #1 field punishment, you're tied to a wagon wheel in a crucifix position and you're left there for 8 hours. So they refused to go on parade and stay in their barracks. That's one. Their trainers, ex-Metropolitan police officers and guardsmen, ended up breaking arms and doing some real damage to some troops. So they're not happy about that. So again, they stay in barracks until this lot shifted out. Company from one of the Welsh battalions, I say Welsh as in the Welsh regiment, from the Rhondda, miners, they had billeted in tents on Salisbury Plain. And they all go down with a really bad dose of bronchitis because they've come out of the mines, warm and moist, and they just go down with bronchitis. And so they basically say, we ain't doing anything. We're not parading until we get proper billets. And lo and behold, they get proper billets. The unionisation of the mines and all of that, they're not used to being messed about. And they ain't going to be messed about by the British Army either. And they actually succeed. It's not just in Welsh regiments. Cheshire Regiment, they have a mutiny up in Preston because of their billets. They haven't got any uniforms. They don't have any food. And it's only averted by the officers clubbing together, going into Preston and buying tents for them. They had to buy tents because the British Army just couldn't cope with the influx of men. They bought a supply of beer for them, which obviously calmed them down. And then they said, right, you can have some representatives that we'll link with, almost like a unionisation. So it wasn't just Welsh regiments, but we became noted for it. And usually, towards the end of the war, when you start getting the Calais mutinies, when the troops now, the war's over, we want to go home, it's the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, 1st and 2nd Battalions, that are 2nd Battalion, that are used to actually put down the mutinies, that they're that trusted, but they're in the regular army. They're not new army or conscripts. So there's an interesting dynamic going on with Welshmen and the British Army. Okay, so moving on. So we get some individuals, a fine body of men. It's obviously Haig, Horn, 15 Corps, Rawlinson, 4th Army, Plumer, it's over there. Where's the one with the nose? I've got a feeling that's Bing. I can't sure Allenby's in there somewhere as well. But that's the British High Command on the Western Front. And Tim Travers, the Australian historian, identifies what he calls the protectors and protege system. It's an old boys network, basically. They all know each other. Okay, they either went to Sandhurst or Camden together, Woolwich together. They served in South Africa together. They went to the staff course together. Horn didn't, he didn't go. So they all know each other, and it really is an old boys network. It's nothing unusual. Back in the Victorian Army, you had Roberts and Wolseley. They had their own little cliques, and they would give each other a leg up. Phillips isn't part of this. Okay, that's why he starts to. He's an outsider. He's not accepted by these people. He's Indian Army. He was only a major. He shouldn't have had the job. And this features this old boys network. Features heavily, I think, in the criticism that goes on about the 38th Welsh Division. One of the things Travers identifies, and again this applies to the criticism from the 7th of July, is that if you were a senior officer and you attacked and you failed, as long as your casualty figures were quite high, that was acceptable, believe it or not. So hence Haig's comments in his diary about the attack on the 7th of July were, you know, barely 100 died. I mean, that's highlight, I mentioned it last week, his diary entry on the 1st of July, the first day of the Somme. It's the worst day for the British Army in history, then and now, for losses. And he doesn't know the actual losses at that point, because obviously they haven't been collated, but we're up at about 35,000 plus. It goes on to 57,000 or something. And he writes in his diary, you know, given the number of assets we've deployed on this day, that's not a bad result. He might be right statistically, but you wouldn't want to bloody write it down. He probably didn't think that the likes of me and other historians were going to read it in years to come, but anyway. So that's all wrapped up in it. The old boys network, protectors, I mean, Haking owes his promotions, his position as Corps Commander to Haig. Haig's snitch, by the way. Haig is he's a blatant careerist. He owes his own positions to being given a leg up in the old boys network. John French was his mentor. He stabs French in the back after lose, no trouble at all. Rawlinson, he was going to be sacked after Neuve Chapelle, where he put the blame of the failure of an attack on a divisional commander. But the divisional commander doesn't lie down. He stands up and fights his corner. And Sir John French found that Rawlinson had lied, and he ostracised him for the rest of his life. He, as I said last week, he walked past him in the corridor, he wouldn't speak to him. It was only Haig's intervention that kept Rawlinson in his job. And Rawlinson actually wrote in his diary, he regarded Haig as a good friend and staunch ally. For the rest of his service, he knew, well, at least he thought he could get away with murder, and he virtually did. So you've got all this meshing together of these individuals. Oh, I mentioned him last week. Llewellyn, Albus, Emeritus, Price Davis, VC. He is also one of the gang. He served in South Africa, where he got his Victoria Cross. He was on Haig's staff at the beginning of the war in 1914. He is well known and well liked amongst his contemporaries, who call him Jane or Mary, depending on which account you read. He does have a bit of a fetish, I think I mentioned last week, for women's underwear, and writing about it to his wife, and writing about not just his wife and women's underwear, but other women who he'd like to see in their underwear. He's a really strange bloke. Hugh Sebag Montefiore, I might mention this, his book on the Somme. He spends 2 chapters on the Mametz wood, which is unusual for a Somme history. And the opening 3 or 4 pages of the one is about Price Davis and underwear and letters. And you can read his letters, there's a book of them, and he's a strange cove. But this, again, and this, you can see the sort of hero worship from Conan Doyle, that book I looked earlier. The wood's divided by a central Rhine running north and south. All to the west, this was allotted to the 113th Brigade, of which he is commander. A unit of the Welsh Fusilier Battalion is commanded by a young brigadier who is more likely to win honour than decoration since he started the war with both the VC and the DSO. So he's very well thought of, despite the fact they call him Jane. And he plays a key role in undermining his own division. I might have thrown this one up last week, but from Llewellyn Wyn Griffith. The second most stupid soldier I met was Brigadier Price Davis, who commanded the 113th Brigade, in which I began my career. He won the Victoria Cross and DSO in South Africa, as he was too dull to be frightened. He was always called Jane by his fellow regulars. And he goes on in the book, he talks about it in the, he'll strut around the trenches and up on the parapet, you know, as if snipers weren't there. He is a daily plague to his brigade, slight, athletic in build and good looking. His mind was slow in working, but tenacious to the point of obstinacy. That's one hell of an insult. It's written, it's beautifully written. It's a really good book. I like it. Although he was titular head of this body to which he issued orders, he commanded no one. He elaborated for our benefit orders he had received from above, but he was no prime mover. Llewellyn Wyn Griffiths was no fan, as you can tell. He's a martinet. He carried a stick with him, which was graded, and he would put it up against the parapet to make sure the firing step was at the right height. He had more, I think it goes on, he says he had more interest in the fact that the latrine buckets were polished than he did for the welfare of his men. He's not well thought of by Llewellyn Wyn Griffith, at least, who is quoted and cited a lot in Somme histories. And he really does drive the knife into his division, as we shall see. So this is his diary entry for the 13th of July. So we're 2 days after Mametz Wood. The night was very noisy, men inclined to panic, but the enemy made no attack. As I said, he's commanding 113th Brigade. 113, 114 lead the attacks on the southern part of the wood. He eventually gets into the wood halfway through day 1, where he meets up with Marden, who's commanding 114. But they're being directed by Watts, so he's not really hands-on in that respect. 16th of July, 3 days later, Douglas Haig came in and congratulated me on our success at Mametz Wood. I thought so he should. It was a success. It shows how close Price Davis and Haig were. So this is where he starts putting the knife in. He writes a report, and it's in the war diary. And part of it is this: the demoralisation increased towards evening on the 10th and culminated in a disgraceful panic, during which many left the wood, whilst others seemed quite incapable of understanding or unwilling to carry out the simplest order. A few stout-hearted Germans would have stampeded the whole of the troops in the wood. Not exactly a glowing write-up of your men who've given their lives. There is no other corroboration that I've found, either in history books or in the National Archives. I've been through all of the letters to Edmonds, the official historian. But he puts this in. Despite what he's already written in his letter home or in his diary, he puts this in. "20th of July, 4 days later, you may think somebody might have had a little word. With reference to my brigade memo of the 16th, forwarding an account of the doings of this brigade on the 10th. This account was made up after the receipt of the accounts furnished by battalion commanders and from my own personal experience. Since then, however, I have had the accounts of certain gallant actions performed by officers and other ranks, and I feel that possibly I may not have given my brigade full credit for what they did in the Mametz Wood. He's backpedaling a little bit now. The interesting thing is his first report, the highly critical report, on the 16th of July. I don't know if you noticed, that's the same date that Douglas Haig visited him. Now, I don't know, if you look at his diary, there's nothing great. You would have thought, oh, his diary or his letter home, he would have written, if there'd been a mass panic and there's all these hundreds of Welshmen running away, you think he might have mentioned that in his letter. You think somebody else might have mentioned it as well. They don't. And I'm wondering whether Dougie, because by this time, by the 16th of July, the attack on the Byzantine Ridge, which started on the 14th, has failed. And they heavily invested in that. They thought that was going to be the breakthrough. Rawlinson had this plan. Everybody was lying outside in no man's land in the dark, waiting for the attack. And I'm wondering, I posit the theory that Haig may have had an influence on, because he's easily swayed, this guy. I don't know, can't prove it yet, but I do wonder whether that was a factor. And then we get, I think my people did better than I thought at first. Many gallant actions have come to light. I wish I could think my people are marvels. I think perhaps I don't advertise them enough, but I do so hate people who brag. Well, he wasn't advertising them enough. He was literally castigating them and calling them cowards. So he wavers, he changes his story. And this is his letter to the official historian in 1930, and it's just this part. Before we get to that bit, the 8th of July is the aborted attack. He is told by Horn, by 15 Corps, to do a bit of a raid. So after the failure of the attack on the 7th, in the early hours of the 8th, his brigade is ordered to, and it's a complete cock-up, if you pardon my French. He starts to put a full battalion in the line to attack the German, and Horn gets wind of this, and there's a panic. No, I just want a couple of companies. No. And it goes horribly wrong, and the orders are confused, and it doesn't happen. The attack doesn't happen. And that's the first thing that alerts Horn, and that's what gets Phillips the sack. Two things about that. Firstly, in the 15 Corps War Diary, it's written by Horn and the Horn staff that the decision to where the attack was to take place in the numbers is on this guy, not on Phillips, and not on the Corps. It says neither division nor Corps can decide where this attack goes in because we're not on the ground. He is. But they still stack Phillips for it. Except it will be seen, therefore, that Major General Phillips did not cancel the operation. He knew Phillips hadn't cancelled the operation, yet he stayed silent when Phillips got the sack. Because he's part of the clique. Phillips wasn't. And then he'd get this, I went forward to arrange consolidation, but soon got involved with parties who were retreating through the wood and whom I had the greatest difficulty in controlling. He's rode right back on that original report. This is mentioned obliquely and very, very briefly by the official historian. But this is the man that really starts that rumour that the 38th bolted and that they were cowards. You know, one of their own commanders, absolutely unbelievable. But that's what he did. In some ways it gets worse. A letter from Horn to his wife, 12th of July. Mametz Wood took a long time to get hold of, but I had new hands doing it, 38th. Not my old friends, 7th Division. And the wood is a difficult job at any time, yeah? We soon finished it up when I got my whole old hands back to it. Absolute nonsense. Watts is a splendid fellow, the best general I have and the most successful. It was he who fought on the Mametz side and they did excellent work. He never went near the bloody wood. He didn't actually go into the wood. And to suggest that his old hands of 7th Division is so dishonest and disingenuous. It beggars belief. And it gets worse. Rawlinson. Now, Rawlinson was the architect of the Somme. He wrote the plan for the whole Somme offensive. Although he was messed about by Haig, he wrote the plan. He also wrote the plan to take Mametz Wood. And Haig let it be known he wanted Mametz Wood by the 7th of July. But we know that the 38th Division only attacked for the first time on the 7th of July. 7th Division and other divisions were already trying to attack it before that. None of them get the blame. 5 divisions were involved in and around Mametz Wood over that period. It's only the Welsh division that gets castigated and ostracised and blamed. None of the others. And this is, these are the questions I was seeking to answer. Why? Why them? Is it because they're Welsh? Is it because it's linked to Lloyd George? Is it because of Phillips and Lloyd George? All of the above. But look at this. I only write a line to say how splendidly our troops have done. Only one division, the 38th, Welshmen, not even 38, Welshmen, turned out badly. And if it had not been for their failure at Mametz Wood, we would have brought off the action today, Byzantine Ridge, at least 48 hours sooner. He blames them for the failure of his planned assault on Byzantine Ridge. No mention of the other, no mention of Horn being in charge and the piecemeal attacks. And actually the Germans, there are German intelligence reports captured days later which say the piecemeal nature of the attacks on the Mametz Wood before the major attack on the 10th, all of which were the responsibility of Henry Horn, emboldened the Germans to reinforce the wood. There was a time, and I mentioned it last week, overnight, 3rd and 4th, Royal Irish went into the wood. There was no Germans there. There were a couple they killed. They could have seized the wood at that point, and the official historian notes that and says, had action been taken on the 4th of July, the losses from there on in the Mametz Wood may not have occurred. And Rawlinson, he wrote another letter. That's to William Robertson. He wrote another one to the Earl of Derby, saying much the same thing. And as I mentioned before, it's not the first time Rawlinson had tried to blame a subordinate for his failures. And even Haig wrote about him in his diary, he has no loyalty to any subordinate. And then the man himself, 10th of July, saw General Horn. He reported General Watts had temporarily taken command of the 38th Welsh Division and had nearly got the whole of Mametz Wood. What effect on a division has a good commander? Absolute nonsense. Watts had been there for barely 12 hours. There's no way that he never spoke to any of the brigades. He might have met the brigade commanders and he met the staff of the division. There's no way he had any impact. And even Haig says that he's a thoroughly stupid bloke. Just a month before, he's writing, he said, oh yeah, he's a good fighter, but he's dull, he's thick. A distinctly stupid man and lacks imagination. 19th of December, he's inspecting Price Davis's brigade. This is a brigade of the Welsh Division which did so badly at Mametz Wood in July by capturing it. The change is due to Blackadder and the Brigadier Price Davis, who were both excellent officers. Well, yeah, Blackadder took over. Price Davis was there. Price Davis was in command on the 10th of July. This, the dishonesty and the duplicity within Haig's diary is staggering. And he's still banging on about it in August of 1918. This is one division in an army of hundreds of divisions, and yet he still bangs on. General Shute, said the 38th Welsh Division had done very well, had had taken Mametz wood where it failed to do so in 1916. This is the Battle of Pozieres in 1918 during the 100 days at the end of the war. And they fight through there again and they do capture Mametz wood for the second time. But he's still banging on it. It's still affecting Haig. And, you know, it begs the question why. If you remember, I mentioned legitimate pride at the beginning. So this is, if you've got a copy, yeah, good for you, I have one, but I wouldn't rely on it. How's my tiny looking so?
10 minutes.
Okay, right, yeah, okay. Anything that is written by Douglas Haig, take it as read, it wasn't written by Douglas Haig. Anything in books after that, it was written by a guy called Boriston, Lieutenant Colonel Boriston, who was his private secretary. He wrote everything. I went up, his papers are up in the Imperial War Museum, and there are letters from Haig to him. And any speech, anything in a history of a division are all written by Boriston. Approved by Haig, but written by Boriston. But he talks about Pilkham Ridge, Third Battle of Eich, and Pozieres, which he mentions in the operation. To both occasions, all who fought with the 38th Division can look back with legitimate pride. Mametz wood isn't in there. Therefore, Mametz wood is not a source of legitimate pride for the 38th Welsh Division. Proved by Douglas Haig. This is Douglas Haig's dispatches. Boriston there, Private Secretary Will Haig. He acted as Private Secretary after the war. He carried on doing it. So this is the dispatch that is produced at various periods during the war, published in the London Gazette and the London Times. But this bit here, says attack McConaughey was undertaken 38th, 17th. Why he mentions Phillips there after the 38th and he doesn't mention Pilcher, I don't know. 3 days obstinate fighting, powerful counterattacks. Entirely cleared of the enemy by the 21st Division. They came in at the bitter end. So again, it's minimising the 38th's involvement, building up the others. This is the real killer. This is Sir Douglas Haig's command. It's written again by Boriston, and historians will say Haig didn't leave a memoir of the Western Front in the First World War. This is his memoir. Haig made sure all of his papers were catalogued and they were given to the British Museum initially. They're now in the National Library of Scotland, and they're flipping hard work getting into because they're still subject to copyright and they're privately owned. I'm lucky. I've got some. The librarian up there gave me copies of entries to his diary. So this is based on, and it's written by Boriston, who will have no bad word said about him, and George Dewar. George Dewar is a newspaper man. He got an awful lot of stick from the liberal press who supported Lloyd George for a story he wrote. And he never forgave them, and he never forgave Lloyd George. And so they write this is the one which builds upon Rawlinson's letter of the fact that because the Welsh division didn't take Mametz wood, the Byzantine Ridge assault failed and the Somme offensive was irreparably harmed. And probably I've got time to go through all this now, but no attack took place. In the course of these operations occurred one of those incidents which can scarcely be foreseen or provided against in war, yet have so often most far-reaching effects upon the course of a campaign. And this is the book that blames the 38th for the failure of Byzantine Ridge and the Somme. And it goes on, he into great detail about blaming Lloyd George as well, and attacking Lloyd George. It's published the date 1922, so those of you with knowledge of history and Liberal Party history will know that 1922 was when Lloyd George was kicked out of office. This book was brought forward. Dewar admitted it was deliberately brought forward in order to harm Lloyd George's potential of winning the election, and many parts of it were not true. And that's documented in letters that he wrote in later life. but nevertheless, and that's where earlier on in one of the slides, a historian in 1919 said, it wasn't 1919, it was 1922, but that's it. You know, the remaining strip of Mametz was occupied by the 7th Division, relieved the 38th Precinct. It is really damning. You know, there is little risk of exaggerating the effect of 3 days delay at this stage of the battle when every hour was of importance. And he's looking back from the July the 14th. But, oh, hang on, go back. Our failure to secure Mametz would, at an earlier date, had an important influence on the course of the battle. That's the Battle of the Somme. The days lost were of greatest value to the enemy. But he goes on earlier in the book about the 1st of July and saying that the reason the 1st of July didn't happen the way it should have was because of the battalions weren't trained properly. They were newbies. You know, they hadn't trained together. None of the excuses he gives to the 1st of July does he put onto the 38th, and you can add to them. So, but then interestingly, and no historian, I haven't found a history of the Battle of the Somme that brings this up. The Commander-in-Chief, Douglas Haig, desires to express his appreciation to all ranks of the 38th Welsh Division for the splendid response made to his appeal for a special effort yesterday. He sent this out. Why is he constantly in his diary and elsewhere castigating the 38th Welsh Division? Duplicitous, disingenuous, dishonest. I'm going to whiz for this. This is really for me, one of the most interesting parts. GBL Drake Brockman was the GSO3 who came over with Watts to the 38th Welsh Division when Watts takes command. And he only serves with the division for about 8 months. He wasn't there when Phillips was there, but he writes a 12-page letter to the official historian. And this is the covering letter of the first, where he says, I was transferred from 7th Division to 38th on the 8th of July. I think it's actually the 9th, but I was amazed at the political atmosphere in the division, which was reflected from the divisional commander downwards. And although I came into contact with a large number of divisions in France, I never came across anything similar. He's parroting stuff there that would have been relevant probably a year before. Through necessity, a lot of the sort of commanders within the 38th, when it was formed, some were local MPs, there were probably about 5 or 6 of them, who were all replaced, other than Phillips and David Davis, who was 16th Welsh Fusiliers. They'd all been moved, they'd all been replaced before they got over to France. You know, the disrepute, and this is, I wish to show the disrepute in which the division fell as a result of the attack on Mametz was not due to the fighting troops. So he really has got it in for Phillips and David Davis, who was an MP. He built the peace camp in Cardiff. Very rich man, used his own wealth to provide kit for his battalion. But Drake Brockman hates him with a passion. As you'll see, the 38th Division suffered from having a number of senior officers who owed their appointments to their political position or to being friends of Mr. Lloyd George. Well, yeah, yes and no. He hits Phillips. David Davis, politician pure and simple, who knew nothing about soldiering before the war. Not true. He was a colonel in the Montgomeryshire militia, TA. It's not therefore not to be wondered that an influential political atmosphere permeated the whole division. And he goes on to say how how Davis is removed to save him. He's being protected. Lloyd George wants to protect him, so he doesn't fight at Mametz Wood. What happens in reality is he actually leaves the division a month before Mametz Wood, because Lloyd George takes over at Ministry of War, because Kitchener's drowned on HMS Hampshire, and he gets Davis out to be his PPS. So it wasn't the night before Mametz would, as Drake Brockman purports. Interestingly, just before the division went to France in December of 15, a delegation of Liberal politicians go to see Asquith to get David Davis pulled, because they say he's such an asset to the party. He's a political thinker. He's also got a lot of money, and they don't think he can be better used in the war effort back in Britain rather than sent out there. We don't know whether Davis ever had that offer. Asquith apparently said, "Yeah, I'll speak to him." If he was offered that opportunity, he didn't take it because he went out. Why then he would come back again, and we'll go into this very briefly if I've got time. That dynamic between the politician, the serving MP, and their duties to Parliament and their constituents, and their duties to the British Army, and there's a huge conflict and stress there in who their master is. But Drake Brockman is really has it in for Phillips. He has it in for Davis. The stuff it was therefore hardly surprising the division in these circumstances did not distinguish itself in the first engagement. Well, that's arguable. As regards the actual attack on Mametz, the orders issued by the General Officer Commander were not likely to inspire confidence because attacks were carried out piecemeal. The divisional commander to each attack made it known that he didn't wish attacks to press home if machine gun fire were met. That, as far as I can tell, is an outright lie. There's no documentation. Nobody else ever mentions it, although historians pick up on it. This bit about piecemeal attacks, Horn was in charge of the attacks, not Phillips. That is just a lie. And he would know that because he was on the staff of 7th Division. He knew what was going on. These are, they're like. And again, conversely, these half-hearted attacks encouraged the enemy considerably. So instead of evacuating Mametz, when he appears to have intended, he kept reinforcing it. And yes, he's right, because the intelligence reports. This is where he talks about Davis on the 6th of July being taken out. It was actually in June. Although interestingly, there's an unpublished biography of Davis in his papers at the National Library of Wales. Not published, written in 1954, and it actually skirts over. It says there's nothing on Mametz Wood other than to say, following Mametz Wood, David Davis left for Britain. Well, he didn't, he left beforehand. Just to finish and Drake Brockman and why, the ultimate question. I don't know the answer, but I've got a theory. And Gareth helped me on this when he picked it up. When we were down in the Gurkha Museum in Winchester doing some research, he came along and was reading through some stuff. Drake Brockman was born in India. His father served in the Indian Army, and he was actually on the Tirah campaign with Phillips. Now, I don't know whether some stories fed back from Dad. I don't know whether Phillips and Dad ever met. I really don't know. But on the Tirah campaign, the chances were Phillips was on the staff of one of the commands, so you might have met him. Whether or not Davis felt that his father should, because he was to continue to serve longer, he should have had the position that Phillips had. I don't know. But there is certainly some sort of previous contact, and there's some conjecture there that I come up with to say that there might be something in that, but what it is exactly, I can't tell you. I mean, Drake Brockman, did I tell a story about him in the Second World War as well, and the German airmen? Very briefly. I mean, he got the Military Cross in 1915. He was a newbie. He got an emergency commission in August 1914. He goes out to the Western Front, so he's an old contemptible. He gets wounded in 15, I think it is. He gets the Military Cross. He's mentioned in dispatches. Obviously gets staff jobs. He survives the war. When he writes this letter, he's in the Royal Tank Regiment, in the Tank Corps. He then, in the 30s, he goes over to India, and he's involved in a massacre in Jaipur or somewhere, where the conflict, the Indian independence is on the rise. So he ends up being involved in the machine gunning of protesters. Second World War, he's back in Britain. He's in command of an area down around the south coast, and one night 2 German airmen are brought in, having been shot down and captured, and they basically, he says that they spat on him, but he gives them couple of good slaps, and he's reported and court-martialed. And this has been by 1940, you know, Battle of Britain, Germans are going to invade, highly trained and experienced soldier, and they sack him. They literally, they don't demote him, they sack him, kick him out of the British Army for slapping a couple of Luftwaffe pilots who've been bombing Britain. So he goes to Canada and he joins up, and he's a trooper in a Canadian regiment, and he's sweeping the floors, he's working in the canteen and tidying up. But over a couple of weeks, somebody sort of looks at him and says, "There's something about this bloke." And they grab him sitting down, and literally within a month of him being there, he's promoted back to major, and he comes back to Britain and he fights through the Second World War. And he's buried in Natal, KwaZulu, in it's a marked grave, but very unkempt. Obviously, doesn't get any visitors. A strange individual, and his animus towards Phillips and Davis in particular, I'm still trying to work through, but there we are. Right, sorry, there was a bit of a rush at the end before I get talking, but I mean, this finally, the final one, the story of Mametz and its comparative failure is not one of wavering men or faint hearts, but bad staff work, inadequate maps, lack of general coordination, and nature's elements.